Well, I'm delighted to see one of my former colleagues from the VA here. That is one of the two contexts in which I have worked for our federal government. The other was as an independent contractor for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Back in the 1980s, when we had a brief flurry of interest in domestic preparedness for all hazards, not all hazards but one, I made a number of trips to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where we have our National Emergency Training Center. I think that speaks volumes about the source of, about the state of our preparedness that they had to get me to come there to speak about nuclear weapons. I had to do kind of an archaeological dig to come up with some of the slides that I'm going to show you. While many areas of research in our country are progressing, this is one area that is regressing. We did a very large amount of research back in the 1950s. We don't even have a library under the control of the United States government where this knowledge is at the present time. The book that is handed out, called Fighting Chance, was designed as a junk mail piece, but it is the most complete review that I know of anywhere of about 1,000 or so most important documents from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Library of research in defensive measures against nuclear weapons. There's a box on a chair back there. If you would like an additional copy, please feel free to take them until they're all gone. We've handed out literally thousands of them at county fairs, and it's a bestseller if you count how many have been mailed to various people. The only serious interest in civil defense that we've had in this country was under President John Kennedy, and the program was one of the many things that died with the assassination of President Kennedy. There was a brief revival in the 1980s under President Reagan, and that's when at NETC we actually handed out copies of the book called Nuclear War Survival Skills that was developed at Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 1950s when the government expressed a serious interest in protecting our population against the nuclear threat. There was a resolution presented at the Arizona Medical Association back in the 1980s, that all of us should cooperate with government officials when they are attempting to save lives in the event of a nuclear incident. You may say, well, how ridiculous that you have to have a resolution before the Arizona Medical Association. Of course, everyone will help to save as many lives as possible. But as a matter of fact, there was and probably still is a movement by physicians to say that it's actually immoral to talk about saving lives as well as being futile, because it would just encourage somebody to use a nuclear weapon if there were any whisper of a chance that somebody might survive such an event. Is the slide projector on? Is the power on? Perhaps you could turn the power on. Okay. One of the old slides that I had concerned the nuclear balance is to say if you're talking about the possibility of a first strike, you have to know how many warheads the bad guy has and how many hardened military targets you have. If you look at it in that way, the imbalance was always in the favor of the other guy rather than the United States. And probably the situation is much worse now, when the strategic balance is no longer two-sided, of course, but China's developing a great capability along with many other nations. And at the same time, the United States arsenal has been deteriorating. We do not test nuclear weapons any longer. We take them apart into 6,000 parts and test them separately using computer simulations and that kind of thing, whereas, of course, China is still testing nuclear weapons. We don't know exactly what the effect of aging is on our arsenal. We no longer manufacture tritium. The Savannah River site, which manufactured tritium, has been shut down. I don't know what our nuclear subs are going to do for fuel, but the United States has 0 tactical nuclear weapons at the present time, and we're continually having to dismantle more of our strategic force. So if we are depending upon deterrence to prevent a nuclear attack, then it's good to keep in mind that the deterrence is decaying, and no one's paying too much attention to it, I don't think. There are a number of delivery mechanisms for nuclear weapons. One might be a terrorist attack. As things become miniaturized, the possibility of a suitcase bomb may actually become a reality. I don't know when. Intercontinental ballistic missiles are proliferating along with the warheads that could use them, and China even has the MIRV technology for the multiple independent reentry vehicles that they stole from us or were given by us, cruise missiles, a boat parked offshore, all kinds of means of delivering nuclear weapons exist. Protective measures, one would be intelligence, to try to find out about the threat. I don't have too much confidence in our intelligence, given that we didn't know that India and Pakistan were about to explode some nuclear weapons. You can try interdicting the threat by a first strike, for example, or by some other means. You can try damage limiting measures in case an attack is launched against you. I guess you can try bribery, but the history of the world doesn't suggest that that will be real effective. Other nations have a different attitude toward protecting their populations from nuclear weapons than we do. This is a quotation from a Russian who's saying that the people who have to worry about nuclear attack are the one who neglect their civil defense studies. Many of the slides that I have here were provided by our government, which obtained them by devious means from the then Soviet Union, and were passed along to me. Something that all Russians learn from kindergarten up through adult education is nuclear weapons effects and how to protect yourself against them. There are several effects of a nuclear weapon. There is blast, heat, radiation, both delayed and immediate. Then there is the electromagnetic pulse that perhaps you have all heard about. And there is another one, just plain terror. The mere threat of nuclear weapons may get your opponent to do whatever you want. The effect of the weapon depends on where you are with respect to ground zero. At the center, there would be essential obliteration of the structures and intense radiation. In the rings around there at different distances, a little bit out from there, the main effect would be fire. In the outer ring, there would still be some fire. There would be a lot of danger from flying debris and the high winds that are generated by the weapon. I think that blank space is to remind me that to ask someone to turn on the overhead projector. The blast effect of a nuclear weapon really isn't any different in principle from any big explosion, and how bad it is depends on where you are located. Within about 0.8 of a mile of ground zero, the peak overpressure would be about 20 pounds per square inch, and even reinforced concrete structures would be leveled. At 3 miles from ground zero, the peak overpressure would be 10 pounds per square inch, and brick structures would be destroyed and distributed as debris. At 4.4 miles, the peak overpressure would be 5 pounds per square inch. Typical residents would be destroyed, heavier construction seriously damaged. Out as far as 11 miles, the peak overpressure would be 1 psi, and there would be damage to structures, but the main mechanism of killing people would be getting hit with debris. And this is really the rationale for the old duck and cover drill, which has been widely ridiculed, but which actually would save a lot of lives. That if you're far enough away from ground zero, the main thing is you're going to get hit in the head with a flying object. Okay, you could turn the overhead off. There are methods of protection. This is just for background. This is a picture of the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus on their visit to Moscow. We'd like to thank our video man who is making a videotape of this, who took some of the photographs in here also. Courtesy of Physicians for Civil Defense, we will have a videotape of this presentation if you want to review it later or distribute it to your friends. We did also videotape the previous one, and the tape was fine, but we hope that maybe speakers, including me, will be a little better with a bit of practice. This is Julian Ackerley, who heads the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus in the foreground, and in the background is a blast door in the Moscow subway. This is the escalator down to the Moscow subway, which is estimated to be about 20 stories below ground. It was designed specifically to be a blast shelter. If you've been on the metro in Washington, D.C., you'll know that it is also quite deep, although not this deep, and they just failed to install any blast doors in the metro. Here is a revolving type blast door, I think in the subway in Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg again. Here's a tilt-up blast door in the Moscow subway. There is another type of blast door. This is the entrance to the blast shelter at the Leningrad Museum of Art. There are shelters everywhere in the Soviet Union. Jeremy took a few pictures of the air vents just walking down the street in Moscow. I don't have any slides of those. There are also some ideas about how to increase the capacity of your shelters, such as by putting platforms over the railroad tracks. Old mine shafts, other ways of building shelters are emphasized in Russia. And, well, we'll just come back to this in a minute. Many other nations have serious civil defense programs. China has an ongoing program, and has sometimes said that you can evacuate the whole city of Beijing in a few minutes underground. That if we were to blast a Chinese city, what we would have is a lot of homeless and very angry Chinese, because they do have a very elaborate system of shelters comparable to the as far as a construction project, to the Great Wall of China. In Switzerland, you cannot build a house without having an NBC, or nuclear biological chemical shelter, as an inherent part of the construction. The United States has tested a lot of shelters. At the Nevada test site, for example, they did build blast shelters and set off the atomic bomb, and found that the mannequins that were standing up in the shelters before the blast were still standing up afterwards. There were a lot of tests done in other places by people who like to set off big explosions. So we do know that the means of construction that have been tested work. That is not to say that everything that is recommended by our government works. I think being in government partly means never having to say you're sorry. There have been FEMA pamphlets distributed on how to build an expedient shelter that will collapse without benefit of the bomb, just as you shovel on it the dirt that you're told to do. However, there are reliable publications such as Nuclear War Survival Skills by Crescent Carney, where these methods have been tested, and the ability of Americans, including school children and little old ladies, has been tested. We have shown that these Americans can build the shelters from reading the directions recently in Oregon, and you can see them on videotape if you care to order a copy of the Nuclear War Survival Skills videotapes. This thing is a model of a NBC shelter built out of a steel tank. These, of course, have to be buried underground to take advantage of earth arching to give the advertised protection here. A shelter that is 8 feet in diameter, buried 8 feet below grade, would give a blast protection of about 200 psi, which means that in a shelter like this, you could survive at ground zero. Perhaps not of a big ground burst, but certainly of an air burst. Oh, back when I was in grade school, we all knew the difference. There were dirty nuclear weapons and there were clean ones. The dirty ones were exploded at ground level and made a huge cloud of dust that became radioactive and produced fallout. Later, there were clean nuclear tests that were exploded above ground. The fireball did not touch the earth, and so there was no fallout problem, or very little fallout problem. Well, this is the blast protection. I guess it doesn't say here what the radiation protection, but it would be about 1,000-fold in a shelter of this type. This is my father, who is demonstrating the comfort of the furniture, which is soft to prevent you from being knocked around inside the shelter if the ground shakes some. And this is us at the Allentown Fair in Pennsylvania, sitting next to a little guy there who is a colonel with a sample of a brilliant pebble, which, if were deployed, could knock down the bomb before it got into orbit on its way to your house. We don't do either of those things. This is just a demonstration of the blast door that's on the tongue of the mobile shelter. A number of these were built with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Arizona owned one, but gave it away when civil defense was dismantled in Arizona. This is the raw material, all those underground gasoline tanks that the EPA is forcing people to dig up, make wonderful shelters. You can build one in your backyard for about $10,000. Save yourself, your friends, and your neighbors if you felt inclined to do so. But a lot of people say, well, we shouldn't even bother thinking about this because if there is one nuclear weapon anywhere in the world, it will blow up the world and we will all die. And at Hiroshima, everybody died. As a matter of fact, there were more casualties in the firebombing of Tokyo than there were in Hiroshima. But the difference was in Hiroshima, it only took one airplane to do all that damage. People who were in lightly damaged buildings, only 8% of them died. At Nagasaki, a lot of people survived because they did have some warning, and a couple of hundred of them were in very simple tunnel shelters into the side of a hill. Well, there's the blast that is a big problem. There's also the heat that is a problem, and half of the casualties at Hiroshima were due to the intense pulse of heat which burned people immediately and which set a lot of fires. There are a number of ways of defending against fire. One is to reduce ignitions. Another is to fight it if it starts, take shelter, and evacuation. Another weapon against American civil defense has been to say, well, if a weapon goes off, there will be a firestorm and your shelters will become crematoria. And the example or proof of that is what happened in the Hamburg firestorm when Americans used incendiaries deliberately to start a firestorm. There is a book called The Night Hamburg Died, which is a science fiction book, which was cited in the New England Journal of Medicine, and after that the New England Journal of Medicine was cited, and so everybody was, including physicians, were promoting the myth that died. Well, as a matter of fact, everybody didn't die even at Hiroshima. This is a picture showing that any type of barrier, including light-colored clothing, blocks the heat pulse of the initial ignition of the weapon. Here you see that underneath the dark clothing, the woman was severely burned. This is a drawing, of course, but it's taken from actual photographs at Hiroshima. Another thing from Hiroshima shows that a little building behind a bush did not ignite, because the pulse is really very brief. As for firefighting methods, you can whitewash the buildings, more from Russian civil defense instruction. You can move the furniture inside, away from the windows, away from where the pulse is going to come in through the windows. You can put sand on the stairways. If you were really serious about civil defense, you would teach people how to fight fire. Well, could they survive in a firestorm? Well, in the first place, there's no evidence that a nuclear blast would be capable of starting a firestorm, at least in an American city, because the fuel loading is probably not high enough. But in Hamburg, actually, there were a lot of people who survived. About 82% of the people did survive the firestorm. And in bunkers, there were only 2 casualties. In Dresden, the situation was similar. There was a firestorm, and there was an American author, Kurt Vonnegut, who survived the Dresden firestorm in a bomb shelter and wrote to tell about it. So the whole myth about don't bother to do anything, it won't work, is just that, a myth. The third big effect that everyone is probably most afraid of, and really is the only thing that is covered in any depth in the book that you're given, is radiation. There are 2 types of radiation. One is the immediate radiation that's released when the bomb explodes. As shown in this thing, the amount that gets to you depends on where you are, how much space and how much mass there is between you and the source of gamma rays. This shows the other type. This is a diagram of the proposed fallout pattern that would occur in the event of a ground burst against Luke Air Force Base near Phoenix. That there would be, if there were a ground burst and a crater formed there, the dirt would be distributed hundreds of miles downwind, providing a possibly lethal dose of radiation to everyone in its path if they did not take shelter. Of course, there would be a certain amount of warning, and people who were had a survival instinct could do things to protect themselves. Defense against radiation is basically barriers, decontamination, and a thyroid blocking agent. For the initial radiation, there is just absolutely no substitute for shelter. Decontamination afterwards, if you don't get too much of it on you, this could save your life. The thyroid blocking agent is because of the fallout particles that get into food and water that may be ingested, and the I-131 gets to your thyroid, may destroy your thyroid or cause thyroid cancer later on. And the defense against that is to block your thyroid ahead of time with potassium iodide, which occupies all the sites in there and makes it impossible for the thyroid to take up very much of the radioactive iodine. There were a number of thyroid cancers after the Chernobyl accident. The Russians do have potassium iodide stockpiled, but they did not distribute it. Those cancers probably would have been prevented had they used it. The United States doesn't even stockpile it. I think they are so afraid that people might misuse it and get an allergic reaction to the iodide that it's better to leave us all vulnerable to this potential in the event of a nuclear incident. On one of the handouts, there is the dose for SSKI, for thyroid blocking agents. And also on your handout, there is some information about the protection factors of various materials. To protect against radiation, the essential feature is density. However, because that's the weight per unit volume. Things that are very dense, like steel or lead, it takes less, but earth, wood, water, anything that has mass has a protective factor. What this 10th value thickness means is that's how many inches of the material between you and the radiation is needed to cut your dose by a factor of 10. Now, the beautiful thing about this is if you double that thickness, you square the protection factor. So if 3.3 inches of steel reduces your dose by a factor of 10, 6.6 reduces it by a factor of 100, 9.9 reduces it by a factor of 1,000. And Earth, of course, is also very dense and very effective in reducing the radiation dose. Oh, here's another feature of the mobile shelter display. This is a piece of equipment that would be in your house if you lived in Switzerland. This is a Luva pump, which brings air into your shelter through filter systems to filter out the radioactive dust that may be in the air, as well as there's a big tank there full of activated charcoal and a HEPA filter to remove chemical and biological agents. The Iraqis ordered a lot of these from Switzerland during the Gulf War to protect their personnel. At that time, it would have been very difficult for you to get one of these things because there was demand for them elsewhere in the world. And this is really very frightening, the prospect of an enemy that not only is known to have chemical and biological weapons, but is taking the means to protect its own personnel against such things. There were a lot of things looking not too much different from those tanks that I showed you that were being transported around in the desert there. Things could have turned out very differently in that war. One way of protecting your food and water from radiation is to cover it up. This does not take a rocket scientist to know that, but it does take someone who has not been terrified by the very mention of anything radioactive. Again, this is from Russian civil defense things. If your food and water is covered, you don't need to worry about radioactive contamination. Of course, if you had a cow that's eaten things that are contaminated, then there may be a problem to be dealt with later. These are methods of measuring radiation, and your book will refer to devices that should be available. That yellow thing there is an old survey meter that we used to have several thousand of them stockpiled in the state of Arizona that were kept calibrated. Right now, I think we have about 6 of them in Pima County, and they are not calibrated. They're trying to figure out how to do that since they don't have a source anymore. Next to it, the little gray box is a charging unit for a dosimeter, and in the foreground, those little pencil or pen-like things are dosimeters, personal dosimeters. You charge it up, and then it's discharged if ionizing radiation strikes it, so you can, by looking through it, determine what your dose was. Next to that is a little thing made out of a tomato sauce can. This is a Carney fallout meter, which is the state-of-the-art equipment available in these United States of America, which has astronauts circling around in space with wrist dosimeters. This is the state-of-the-art instrument available to Americans. It was invented by Crescent Carney at Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 1950s. It doesn't need to be calibrated because its use depends solely on the geometry. You can build one yourself. It takes about 4 to 6 hours, so I suggest not waiting until the last minute. That is one of the many things that is described in Crescent Carney's book, Nuclear War Survival Skills. I took mine down to the Nuke Med department at the University of Arizona, and the doctor there very kindly allowed me to put it next to the technetium dose that somebody was about to get into his veins for a bone scan, and I was able to show that my meter was really quite accurate. Sitting in back of that is a bottle of Dryerite. That's the desiccant. You need to keep the inside of your ionizing chamber dry, or it won't work very well. In front of it, there is a plastic ruler, which is the Carney fallout meter charging device. You rub it against something to generate a static charge and put it up next to the meter to charge it. There were actually descriptions of how to do something like this in Parade magazine back in the 1950s. Again, when people were serious about trying to survive in the event of a catastrophe. Well, one reason you want to be able to measure the radiation is you want to know how long it is necessary for you to stay in shelter. Now, some people say, oh, I wouldn't want to live in a bomb shelter for the rest of my life. Well, gee, you wouldn't have to. One of the handouts that I gave you is a printout from Nuclear War Survival Skills. This is from the internet version of the book. It's not of the greatest quality because it's scanned and then it goes on the internet and then it's printed out. But this displays the rule of sevens. That is to say, if you have a dose of 1,000 rads per hour, 1 hour after the blast, if you multiply the time interval by 7 so that you get 7 hours, you divide the dose by 10 so that your rate at 7 hours would be 100 rads per hour. Multiply by 7 again so that you get about 49 hours, your dose would be down to 10 rads per hour. That is a feature of the mixture of isotopes that would be in the fallout. So being able to measure this is very important to know how long shelter is required. On one of your handouts there is information about how to order a copy of the book Nuclear War Survival Skills. It's a bargain. It's an 8.5 by 11 book about this thick, chock full of information that was developed by actual hands-on research. It's only 1950. I wouldn't depend on the internet because one EMP might be able to shut the whole internet down. So if you wait till then to print out your book or to get a copy of, that will be too late. Paper and pencil may be archaic, but it is EMP protected. Let's see, I think that may be a sign to put up the next transparency. Yeah, that one. Yeah. This shows radiation activities. One of the reasons that people are so fearful of nuclear weapons is because they don't understand too much about radiation. There has been so much hype about the dangers of radiation. Now, of course, in an adequate dose, radiation will undoubtedly kill you. And you have on your paper handouts, the dose that it takes to do the job. If you get only 0 to 100 rems, the effect will be subclinical. You will probably feel perfectly fine. If you get 100 to 200 rems, there may be some radiation sickness, but probably you will recover completely within a few weeks. Now, afterwards, many years afterwards, you may come down with cancer. It has been demonstrated with the survivors of the Hiroshima blast that about 2 years after that, there was an increased incidence of leukemia. Between 10 and 20 years later, there is an increased incidence of solid tumors. And some people said and wrote, well, you might as well go out and die in the street and die immediately because otherwise you might get cancer. Yeah, 20 years later, if the choice were up to me, I'd rather not die today as opposed to in 20 or 30 years. But another factor that we have learned by a very long-term follow-up of this group of people that has probably been more carefully studied than any group of subjects in history is that this far out, those who received a rather low dose of radiation actually have a better survival than those who did not receive any radiation. This is an idea of the amount of radiation found in things that we don't worry about, like beer, whiskey, scotch, or salad oil. the amount that is in those things is vastly more than the amount that is of regulatory concern if it's in the wastewater from a nuclear power plant. I would suggest you're more likely to drink whiskey than you are to drink that wastewater, but somehow we don't worry about that as much. Let's see. Okay, these are some slides from your book. Mr. Carney used to say, well, I'm going to use the Pentagon method. I'm going to put a view graph up, and I'm going to read out loud to you things that you could perfectly well read for yourselves. I have not done this with very many of the slides that are in your book. I do encourage you to look at the material in the book. There are several types of ionizing radiation. There's alpha, beta, and gamma, the ABCs. The alpha particle is really 2 neutrons and 2 protons. It's really a helium nucleus that's been stripped of its electrons. It is highly ionizing. It does have a very high biological effect in that it's more likely to do damage to the body than is a gamma ray. However, it doesn't have very much penetrating power, and it's stopped by a thin piece of paper or clothing. The damage from a gamma emitter comes if you ingest it, like if you breathe it or you eat it. And this is one of the worries about radon that gets into your lungs and may set up a lung cancer. And if you get a high enough dose of it, I'm sure that it will. On the other hand, there is extensive evidence by studying the counties of the United States that have 93% of the population that at the levels likely to be found in your home, the incidence of lung cancer decreases with an increased dose of radon. So if you live in a high radon house, I would suggest that you charge a higher rent for it, because it does have some protective value against cancer. I bring this up only to say that, there's a lot of hysteria about radiation. We need to put things in perspective and know what the true risk is and not panic at things that are not so bad. But it's to say alpha emitters, they can do damage if they're in your body, although probably not as much as reputed. There are a lot of people walking around with plutonium in their lungs because they worked in the nuclear industry in its earlier days. They've had a very long life expectancy. Martin Kamen, who is the discoverer of carbon-14, who can't go a lot of places because he sets off the radiation alarms, he's so radioactive, is doing very well in his 80s. There are beta emitters. These are high-energy electrons. Beta is a little bit more penetrating than alpha. A piece of tinfoil, though, will stop it. A few millimeters of tissue will stop it. The main effect of beta is if you get it on your skin, it will burn. At Alamogordo, there were some cows that they didn't manage to evacuate before they set off the bomb, and these cows got a big dose of radiation. They put them in the train and took them up to Oak Ridge where they could watch them very carefully. These cows had very beta burns in their hides, and I think that somewhere they had these hides displayed at Oak Ridge after the cow died. Actually, the cow had a very normal life expectancy and gave birth to a lot of normal little calves in the meantime. But beta burns will burn you. You don't want to get it on you. If you get it on you, you want to wash it off. There are some examples of half-lives of various types of radioactive materials. It is not very widely understood that the longer the half-life, the less dangerous the thing is as far as the radiation standpoint goes. It's the really short half-life stuff that's really hot that gives you the big dose of radiation. And yet everybody's concerned about plutonium, which has essentially, in some forms, an infinite half-life, or a half-life of thousands of years, so that you're not going to get too much radiation from it. There has been a lot of hype about plutonium being the most dangerous substance known to man. Dr. Bernard Cohen, who's professor of physics at the University of Pittsburgh, has a bet that's gone out. No one has taken him up on this yet. He has offered to eat as much plutonium, gram per gram, as someone else will eat of caffeine. Peter Beckman, the late Peter Beckman, went a little further than that. He's volunteered to eat and eat until death do us part. No one ever took him up on that either. Nevertheless, you do want to minimize your exposure to radiation, but this is not a situation for being panic-stricken at the mere mention of the word. Terrorist use of nuclear material. They might spread radioactive materials without an explosion. Yes, they might. And there are probably some science fiction stories written about somebody putting plutonium into the ventilation system. If this were to happen, I would probably say, look out, they are distracting all of your emergency response personnel, and there's going to be another incident somewhere else with something that goes bang. Anybody who's gathering up plutonium, which is rather difficult, is probably going to use it to try to make a bomb. Putting in the radiations in the ventilation system just really wouldn't do it. And it's just really not very terrifying for people to think, well, maybe I'll have a slightly higher risk of cancer 30 years from now. If you're a terrorist, you really want people to drop dead immediately. And I will leave that to Sheldon Marks and John Sullivan to talk about things that really would be very dangerous in the ventilation system and also are rather likely and have even occurred. I'm glad here they put cobalt-60 instead of plutonium. Cobalt-60 would have the potential of giving people quite a big dose of it. In fact, there was a cobalt source that got sent to Mexico and junked, and some accidentally unknowing people put it into things that were exported everywhere, and a lot of people did get radiation sickness as a result of that. Typical radiation exposures. These are in millirems. The LD50 is 450,000 millirems, or 450 rads. That means half the people exposed to that will die, and half of them will survive. You can look at those in your book. Acute radiation sickness. It generally takes a whole body exposure of greater than 100 rads to bring on the symptoms of radiation sickness. Most probable following exposure to gamma rays or penetrating radiation, but it can occur from internal contamination. The symptoms give you some sign of the dose. The more immediate the symptoms occur, the higher the dose probably was, and the worse the prognosis is. So that's something to keep in mind if you have a lot of people that you're caring for. Gives you an idea of who is expected to survive and who isn't. There's a prodromal phase of initial nausea and vomiting. There's a latent period when people feel better, but the damage to their blood-forming organs is ongoing. Then there's an illness phase, and then a recovery over a period of weeks to months. During the illness phase, they lose all their hair. They're in danger of infection and bleeding and severe anemia because of damage to the bone marrow. Radiation sickness is not a nice thing to have. Once it occurs, you can support the person with fluids, with blood, with antibiotics. And as I say, if the dose is not too high, there's a chance he might survive. A bone marrow transplant as a heroic measure might help in certain cases. But the key thing is to put shielding and distance between you and the source of the radiation in order to prevent this from happening in the first place. These are the GI symptoms. Radiation greater than 600 rads is mainly a GI syndrome. The lining of the bowel breaks down with ensuing sepsis because of the bacteria getting into the rest of your body. Death within about 10 days. The most dramatic thing is the central nervous system syndrome. We've only actually seen a few cases of these, very limited number of cases, in people who were involved in accidents early in the days of the development of the nuclear industry. And the death occurs very, very quickly. There is another transparency there. Yeah, about the cost effectiveness. Some people say, well, civil defense is so expensive we shouldn't even bother with it. This is just a table of how many dollars we're willing to spend to save a life which is threatened by a number of different threats. Immunizations in Indonesia cost about $210 per life saved. Improved sanitation, about $4,000 per life saved. Airbags, $640,000 per life saved. Stringent precautions, more stringent precautions in nuclear power plants, about $2.5 billion per life saved, because the plant is inherently so very safe to begin with. If you look at the cost of civil defense, I can't give you the cost per life saved because you have to factor into this the probability that these things would be needed. A blast shelter space costs between $200 and $2,500 if you use buried steel tanks. It's the higher range is for use of concrete shelters. A year's supply of grain costs about $144. Strategic defenses might cost $1,000 per life saved if we deployed a brilliant pebbles type of system, an orbiting system, which the United States government seems determined not to do. So all of these things, I think, are tremendously cost-effective, but people need to know that what the effects of nuclear weapons are, what the effects are not, and what we can do to defend ourselves if we choose to take that action. Let's see. I think I have perhaps a little bit of time to take some questions now. Are we about on schedule, Mr. Johnson?
Yes, you're doing very well.
Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
If you would just briefly give me a cross-reference for the Pico Curies with REMS. Can you compare the two?
It's a little bit difficult because the Pico Curies, it depends on the substance. You know, I have looked for that conversion factor myself, and every time I do it, it requires some study, and it's a little difficult. I mean, Pico Curies has, you know, how much radiation it puts out, but it's a good question.
So it's not an easy transfer from one to the other.
No, I can't do it off the top of my head, but it can be done.
I'll look it up.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is there a method of education being carried out for like high schools or colleges or such? Because the main thing is the word radiation. This runs fear in all these, everybody, from kids to old people, and yet, like you say, the very logical presentation. Is there anything being done in organized manner for high schools and colleges and such where it might influence the people?
No, there isn't, and I think that really is an outrage because one of the effects of nuclear weapons is terror. And we're not only terrified of the weapons themselves, so that we're paralyzed at doing anything to protect ourselves, but we are terrified of nuclear technology, which is immensely beneficial to saving human life as well as to having a productive economy. No, this is something that we very much need. Yes, Mr. Johnson?
How much of a threat is there to secondary exposure? In other words, if a patient were brought to an emergency room who had a significant exposure to radiation, can that person contaminate the healthcare worker?
Excellent question. If you have been exposed to external radiation like gamma radiation, you do not become radioactive. It's just like you are not radioactive after you get an X-ray. Now, if you come in with fallout all over your clothing, then you know, and the dirt is radioactive, yes, of course, you are a hazard, and the thing to do is to decontaminate. Get rid of the clothing, wash the person with copious quantities of water, especially his hair and all of his skin. If the person has ingested radiation, like alpha emitters would be primarily the problem, then he might be radioactive to a certain extent, although remember that alpha does not have a very great penetrating power, so the danger to the people around him might be quite minimal. You know, if you treat a person with radioactive implants, yeah, they are slightly radioactive, but you know, we don't worry about going near them as a general rule. But that is a very, very important point to realize, that just because someone has radiation sickness does not mean that he is a danger to you. Not at all. You do not, unless he's contaminated with fallout particles, he is just not a threat. Yes, sir.
I believe RADS and REMS are equivalent, aren't they?
No, RADS has to do with the intensity of radiation, and REMS has to do with the biological effectiveness. The RADS are about equal to the REMS for gamma radiation, but the REMS are a lot higher for alpha radiation. So that, I mean, if you ingest an alpha particle, it has a more intense biological effect than gamma rays do.
Does this chart imply it's safe to come out after 48 hours? Or?
It depends on what the initial dose was. And you have to measure what the dose is. You know, 10 rads per hour, that's still something you might not want to. That means in 10 hours you've got 100 rads. And so you would want it to decay to a reasonable level. But, you know, how you're going to make your decision depends on how badly you need to go outside the shelter. If you're dying of thirst, then you may want to go out in search of water, even though that's a risk you wouldn't take if you had a plentiful water supply. That, by the way, is the most important thing to have in your shelter is water. You can live for a month without food. You can live only for a few days without water. Interestingly, we do have some tunnels in the United States that might serve as shelters, but it is against the federal law to stock it with anything, even water. At the Boeing plant, the place where they manufacture 747s near Seattle, they have some wonderful areas of tunnels that would be great fallout shelters. But because Boeing has federal contracts and gets money from the federal government, it is literally a crime for them to put anything in these tunnels that might enable people to survive nuclear war in them. Yes, sir.
What and who prompted that law?
I have no idea. But the federal government had a flurry of interest in civil defense in the 1980s. As soon as Reagan left office, they began dismantling the system that they had. For a while, they passed out nuclear war survival skills at these conferences where emergency managers from all over the United States used to come. No more can you display a copy of nuclear war survival skills there. There is no longer an Office of Civil Defense in the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The new piezoelectric dosimeters that they were working on, that you charge them with friction, they were working on them for about 5 years, but I don't think they ever came into existence. The library at Oak Ridge has been given away to Texas A&M if you want it. The status in this country of preparedness is terrible. And as I said, the instruments that we had in Arizona were given away. Actually, I'm glad of that. They would have been destroyed had they not been given away. And the only problem now is that there's no means of calibrating them. So these are fairly sobering thoughts. Crescent Carney determined all the way back in 1950 the federal government was not going to do anything to protect the American population from this threat, and that is why he devoted his life to research on expedient civil defense that Americans could do for themselves. Unfortunately, most of the experts in this area are either dead or very old. We do have audio tapes of a number of them who have spoken at meetings of Doctors for Disaster Preparedness over about the past 6 to 8 years, and if you're interested in a CD-ROM that has these voices from the past, essentially, I'd be glad to give you one. I would suggest the first thing to do is to read Fighting Chance and to get yourself a copy of Nuclear War Survival Skills. Even if you don't read it now, have one in your house. Other questions? Then I guess we're about right on time.